Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, we will now begin the interactive dialogue on the oral presentation of the High Commissioner of the findings of the periodic report of the OECHR on the situation of human rights in Ukraine, as mandated in the Human Rights Council Resolution 53/30, and on the interim report of the Secretary General on the situation of human rights in the temporarily occupied Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine, as mandated in the General Assembly Resolution 17/221. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to Mr. Volker Türk, High Commissioner for Human Rights, for his presentation. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Yesterday's massive missile attacks across Ukraine, including the horrifying strike on Okhmadid, Ukraine's largest children's referral hospital, once again lay bare the disastrous consequences of the war waged against Ukraine by the Russian Federation. I'm outraged by the sight of children already so vulnerable in war, suffering the terror of attack while receiving medical treatment. Appallingly, we see this again and again, not just in Ukraine, but also in Gaza, Sudan, and elsewhere. Our common humanity is lost in such instances. It begs the question again and again why the dangerous ideology of past centuries is back with such a vengeance. After all that happened in the 20th century and with the founding of the United Nations, we would have thought the world had overcome such atavistic and perilous thinking. These relentless daily attacks across the country continue to aggravate the human rights situation of civilians, causing physical harm, destroying homes and infrastructure, and ripping families apart, leading to long-term socio-economic challenges, including diminished access to education, loss of livelihood, and poverty. The month of May saw the highest monthly verified civilian casualty number in nearly a year, with 174 civilians killed and 690 injured in Ukraine. According to my team on the ground, between March and May, 436 civilians were killed and 1,760 injured, including children, media workers, healthcare workers, and emergency service personnel. The actual figures are likely much higher. These high civilian casualties are largely the result of the ground offensive and aerial attacks, including with powerful air-dropped bombs that took place in Kharkiv region. And since the 10th of May, nearly 12,000 people were evacuated from the border regions, and several thousand others fled their homes on their own out of fear for their lives. Coordinated, large-scale attacks by the Russian Federation against Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure, deployed through 8 major waves since the 22nd of March, have been the most extensive since the winter of 22-23. Such attacks must stop immediately. They have targeted power, generating and distribution facilities, significantly degrading Ukraine's capacity to generate electricity. Millions of people across Ukraine experience daily power cuts, often for many hours at a time, reducing access to water supply, mobile and internet connectivity, public transportation, and restricting children's ability to study, as many in Ukraine attend school remotely. Knock-on effects are expected on employment, tax revenues, and social protection. Price increases are likely to affect groups in situations of vulnerability disproportionately, especially older people with low pensions, the majority of whom are women, persons with disabilities, and people living in poverty. But the worst is possibly yet to come, as energy companies and the Ukrainian authorities caution that repeated strikes have reduced the ability to make the necessary repairs to heat homes during winter. Again, senseless suffering. Mr. Vice President, recently released Ukrainian prisoners of war have provided detailed accounts of torture, ill treatment, and sexual violence. They described brutal beatings, prolonged stress positions, electric shocks and beatings to genitals, dog attacks, and severe food deprivation. Based on interviews with over 600 released Ukrainian civilian detainees and POWs, torture in places of detention run by the Russian Federation is widespread. This is abominable. I urge the Russian Federation immediately to cease such practices, to improve detention conditions, establish mixed medical commissions, and to grant full access to my office and to independent monitors to all places where Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees are held, including in occupied territory. My team in Ukraine also interviewed dozens of relatives of POWs and civilian detainees who had not heard from their loved ones in months or even years, and some no word at all. This silence is agonizing for families. The Russian Federation must ensure, in line with international law, timely information is shared on the fate and whereabouts of POWs and civilian detainees and allow communication with families. My office also continued to document the torture and ill treatment of Russian POWs after capture and while in transit to official places of internment, including beatings and electric shocks. According to our information, the torture of Russian POWs ceased when the POWs arrived in official places of internment. The Ukrainian authorities need to investigate these instances and ensure the treatment of POWs at every stage is in line with international law. I call for the complete exchange of all prisoners of war and the unconditional release of those civilians unlawfully detained, including in occupied territory, and for their safe return. My office stands ready to support such efforts. I reiterate that children deported or transferred to the Russian Federation must be returned immediately. I urge the Russian Federation to provide information to the Central Tracing Agency about all children moved from occupied territory and to facilitate their return to their families. In government-controlled territory, Ukrainian authorities continued to convict people on charges of collaboration activities, including for doing work that benefited the population, such as restoring gas supply or distributing wood for heating. Guilty verdicts were handed down in all 322 judgments issued during the reporting period. I welcome the guidelines recently issued by the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, seeking to ensure that prosecution of such cases is aligned with international law and encourage implementation in full. In occupied territory, my office has documented increased pressure on residents to obtain Russian passports. Many people who recently left the occupied territory, notably older people, reported experiencing difficulties in accessing healthcare without Russian citizenship. Parents reported being under pressure to obtain Russian passports to send their kids to school. I recall that compelling residents in occupied territory to obtain the citizenship of the occupying power is a violation of international humanitarian law. I now turn to the Secretary General's report on the human rights situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. It highlights ongoing violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law by the Russian Federation, including arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances and torture, and violations to the freedoms of opinion, expression, peaceful assembly, and association. People perceived as opposing the occupation, including bloggers, journalists, supporters of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, and pro-Ukrainian activists are targeted. This is all occurring in a context of near impunity, with the Russian Federation adopting laws effectively granting amnesty to service persons for a broad range of crimes. Mr. Vice President, the pursuit of war, the practice of escalation cannot become the new normal. I urge the Russian Federation once again immediately to cease its use of armed force against Ukraine, withdraw its military forces from the territory of Ukraine in line with the order of the International Court of Justice, and scrupulously to respect international humanitarian and human rights law. There needs to be an immediate stop to the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. During the reporting period, 96% of civilian casualties were caused by the use of such weapons in such circumstances. My office will continue meticulously to monitor, document and report on the ground realities of this awful war, including in occupied territory. Accountability must be served. War is the worst enemy of human rights. It is an aberration, not just in the current context, but also everywhere else. It has to be shunned, and peace must be found in line with the United Nations Charter and international law. That is the most fervent wish of Ukrainians. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. High Commissioner. According to our practice, we will start by hearing the delegations of the countries concerned by the report. I see that the representative of the Russian Federation is not in the room. And I would now like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We extend our gratitude to the High Commissioner for presenting the Office's comprehensive reports, which provide undeniable evidence of Russia's heinous crimes against the Ukrainian people. Today is yet another difficult day for Ukraine as we mourn the victims of yesterday's terror attack when Russia unleashed a barrage of missile strikes across my country, resulting in the deaths of at least 38 people and injuring 170 others. Among the targeted civilian objects was the largest national children's hospital, Ohmedit, where seriously ill children received life-saving medical treatment. In a cruel twist of fate, Russian war criminals are attacking innocent children who are courageously battling cancer. Recent waves of bombardments have left a trail of death and plunged millions into darkness. This savage assault threatens to rob Ukrainians of essential services, casting a foreboding shadow over the approaching winter months. Latest images of Ukrainian prisoners of war, those hors de combat, and civilian detainees made shortly after their release from Russian captivity depict a chilling reality of oppression and terror. Families, in a desperate search for answers about the fate of their loved ones, face a deafening silence or outright denial from Russian authorities, raising the specter of enforced disappearances. Amidst this chaos, the Secretary General's interim report underscores that the international community must not lose sight of the human rights situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea. Russian authorities are tightening their grip on residents, coercing them into obtaining Russian citizenship and illegally conscripting them into the Russian army. Those who resist Russia's occupation are systematically targeted, as evidenced by the January judgment of the International Court of Justice regarding the persecution of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians in the occupied territories. High Commissioner, we have taken careful note of the information on alleged violation by the Ukrainian side and the recommendations in the report, which will be rigorously examined to ensure necessary actions are taken in line with our national legislation and international obligations. Even in the face of blazing aggression, Ukraine remains unwavering in its commitment to international humanitarian and human rights law. We demand the Russian Federation do the same. As an occupying power, it must bear full responsibility for the human rights catastrophe unfolding in the Ukrainian territories under its temporary military control. The harrowing accounts of widespread torture and ill treatment, including abhorrent acts of sexual violence, must cease immediately. Human rights and humanitarian mechanisms must be granted full and unimpeded access without delay. Distinguished delegates, 2 weeks ago, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights published its judgment in the case of Ukraine versus Russia regarding Crimea, recognizing numerous heinous crimes committed by Russia since the temporary occupation of Crimea in February 2014, including abduction and forced disappearance, unlawful detention, torture, and ill treatment of political prisoners, violation of freedom of expression, religion, and peaceful assembly, and deprivation of property. In the same week, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for former Russian Defense Minister Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Army, Gerasimov, in connection with alleged international crimes committed in Ukraine. Both have now joined their Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Putin, who has been on the arrest warrant list as a suspect in war crimes since March 2023. This irrefutably shows that justice is within reach. The sooner Russian aggression and war crimes end, the faster, just, and lasting peace will be restored. As demonstrated by the Global Peace Summit, over 100 states and international organizations share a vision of peace based on the respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine and UN Charter. We urge all UN member states to join these international efforts to implement the principles of the Ukrainian peace formula, the only viable path to achieving this goal. It is imperative to stand united in condemning Russia's atrocious crimes, demanding the immediate release of all unlawfully detained Ukrainians, and ensuring that those responsible are held accountable for their monstrous actions. We must act now, as every hour of every day counts. I thank you.
Thank you. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the High Commissioner and to make comments on his presentation. I give the floor to Latvia on behalf of Group of Countries via video.
Mr. President, I speak on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic states. Since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia has committed atrocities that may amount to war crimes and perpetrated grave violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. The weaponization of sexual and gender-based violence and unlawful deportation and transfer of children are among the most appalling crimes. Russia must ensure unhindered access for human rights monitoring mechanisms in this regard. Persecution of journalists and civil society, politically motivated sentencing, arbitrary detentions, torture, forced conscription are an acceptable reality faced by the people of Ukraine. Russia's efforts to eradicate Crimean Tatar language, Ukrainian language, identity and cultural heritage through indoctrination and assimilation further exposes the imperial nature of the war of aggression. Russia must be held fully accountable for these human rights violations. And Mr. High Commissioner, following up on the Summit on Peace in Ukraine, what instruments do we have to further mobilize international community to bring Ukrainian people home from Russia?
Thank you. I would also like to inform that the list of speakers is closed. Now I would like to give the floor to the European Union.
Thank you. Mr. High Commissioner, the European Union condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine and Russia's continuing violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in Ukraine, including arbitrary detentions, torture, ill treatment, and forced disappearances and sexual and gender-based violence, and the unlawful transfer and deportation of civilians, including children. In this vein, we deplore yesterday's Russian missile missile attack against the Children's Hospital in Kiev. We are alarmed by the findings of your report, highlighting the Russian attacks on civilian objects, including on critical energy infrastructure. In the attacks on civilian infrastructure, the Russian armed forces employs a so-called double-tap tactic, where an initial strike is followed by a second strike, killing first responders as they arrive to save lives. This method of war is morally despicable and a violation of international law. We are concerned by the testimonies of numerous prisoners of war and civilian detainees of torture whilst in Russian captivity. Your report emphasized the need to ensure accountability for the grave violation of international law committed in connection with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Mr. President, could you address from the perspective of international law and human rights law the evidence that attacks on civilian infrastructure are being used as a military strategy by Russia? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Denmark on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm pleased to deliver this statement on behalf of the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine. We condemn Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, including the latest waves of strikes, destroying hospitals, killing dozens of civilians, among these many children. A war that causes immense human suffering and violates international law, including the UN Charter. And we are appalled by the reports of Russia's use of torture, well documented in the latest report by the OHCHR. We call on all parties to ensure that survivors receive assistance, and we call for the immediate and unconditional release of the OSCE staff who Russia has been unjustly detaining for more than 800 days. Mr. President, Russia shows no intention of holding perpetrators to account. On March 23rd, President Putin signed into force a new law expanding the exemption from criminal accountability for members of Russia's armed forces. Dignity and justice must be restored for the countless victims of Russia's aggression. Those responsible must be held to account. High Commissioner, what can we do to support the investigation of cases of transferred or deported children and the use of torture against prisoners of war and civilian detainees to help ensure future accountability for its perpetrators? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you. Ireland aligns with the EU statement, and we thank the High Commissioner for his update. Ireland reiterates its condemnation in the strongest possible terms of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine and of Russia's continuing violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in Ukraine. We are appalled by Russia's continued use of widespread torture, ill-treatment and arbitrary detention. We are similarly appalled by the reported large-scale transfers of Ukrainian civilians, including children. Ireland strongly condemns Russian armed forces' use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which has caused substantial destruction and civilian harm. We also condemn attacks on the same location or target in quick succession, killing first responders, particularly if this is a deliberate tactic to maximize harm to civilians. We were appalled this week at Russia's attacks on a children's hospital in Kiev and across Ukraine, with many killed and wounded. Ireland has consistently demanded that Russian authorities be held accountable for flagrant violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The role of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine in monitoring and preparing evidence-based and impartial reports on the situation in Ukraine is critical to addressing impunity and ensuring accountability. We underline our support to its work and to all international efforts to hold Russian authorities accountable. High Commissioner, how is the work of your office contributing to early accountability measures? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We thank the High Commissioner for his oral update. Liechtenstein condemns the continuous breaches of international humanitarian and human rights law perpetrated by Russian armed forces and their affiliates. We are appalled by the reports of the recent attacks against hospitals resulting in the death of dozens of people. The Ukrainian civilian population, especially vulnerable groups, continues to endure immense suffering, exacerbated by attacks on critical infrastructure. These assaults have led to widespread power outages, severely impacting essential services. We are further concerned by the reports about precision attacks in rapid succession, resulting in civilian casualties, including emergency responders. Additionally, increased pressuring methods by Russian authorities in occupied territory force Ukrainian residents, including school-aged children and individuals in need of medical services, to obtain Russian citizenship, violating international humanitarian law. This further endangers vulnerable groups, such as older persons and children. The forced transfers of Ukrainian children are particularly distressing in this context, demanding immediate, credible investigations and accountability. Liechtenstein remains committed to its efforts supporting Ukrainians, particularly vulnerable groups, through various initiatives and reaffirms its solidarity with them. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Poland.
Mr. Vice President, Poland aligns itself with the EU statement. Poland remains deeply concerned about the continued for more than 800 days unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine and ongoing violations of international human rights and humanitarian law perpetrated by Russian forces in the territory of Ukraine. We are particularly troubled by the arbitrary detention of civilians and forced disappearances, the widespread use of torture and ill treatment, summary executions, and deportation of Ukrainian children. The level of destruction and suffering that Ukraine continues to face is hard to comprehend. We continue to call on Russia to end its lethal attacks against Ukrainian population and critical infrastructure that aggravates the humanitarian situation on the ground, and to end its occupation of Ukrainian territories, including Crimea. Poland supports efforts to ensure accountability for human rights violations and abuses committed by Russian forces in Ukraine and strongly supports the work of OHCHR in this regard. Mr. High Commissioner, how can the international community better support the survivors of Russian atrocities? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. We take note of the two reports presented today. Their findings should be a matter of grave concern for the international community. International humanitarian law must be observed. We're distressed by its many violations. Turkey has been supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence since the occupation and annexation of Crimea in 2014. The situation of the Crimean Tatar Turks, the indigenous people of Crimea, has always been a priority for us. Turkey will continue to support our Crimean Tatar kinsmen with a view to preserving their identity and ensuring that they live in their historical homeland in peace and safety. We have also been supporting the Crimean Platform Initiative since its inception. On various occasions, we expressed our concerns about questionable prison sentences brought against Crimean Tatars and called for the necessary steps to ensure their immediate release. We greatly welcome the release of Nariman Celal, the deputy chairman of the Crimean Tatar Mejlis, as part of their prisoner exchange. We expect further steps to be taken for the immediate release of our Crimean Tatar kinsmen who remain imprisoned, including Hasan Ahmetov and Aziz Ahmetov. We maintain our efforts to this end. Finally, it is important to keep Crimea and the situation of Crimean Tatars on the agenda of the international community. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement, and we thank the High Commissioner for his update, thorough but very concerning, and the presentation of the Secretary General's report. And I'd like to convey our condolences to the many victims of yesterday's horrifying attack in Kiev. Mr. Vice President, almost 900 days after Russia launched its unprovoked and unjustified full-scale aggression against Ukraine, and 10 years after it annexed Crimea, the HD's report confirms once more what was brought to light by the COI and the HRMMU. Russia has instituted a climate of fear in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine. The patterns of atrocities, which they fine-tuned during 10 years of annexation of Crimea, have now been exported en masse to newly occupied territories. Arbitrary detention, torture, sexual violence, summary execution, Russification, illegal transfer and deportation of civilians, including children. These violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law are perpetrated in an atmosphere of impunity. That is unacceptable. That is why the Netherlands organized, together with Ukraine and the European Commission, a ministerial conference on restoring justice for Ukraine in The Hague last April. And that is why we support the work of the ICC and welcome the recent issuance of 2 additional arrest warrants. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, Mr. High Commissioner. Portugal aligns with the EU statement and welcomes these 2 reports. We condemn the brutal, unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, which destroyed the lives of so many civilians, their homes, and prevented them from access to basic services for over 2 years now. We are very concerned that the Russian authorities are pressuring the population of the temporarily occupied areas to obtain Russian citizenship and are restricting their rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of opinion and expression. In addition, hundreds of civilians are being arbitrarily detained and subject to torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence. This situation is unacceptable and constitutes a serious violation of the rights to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty and security. We reiterate our call for Russia to immediately cease its aggression. These findings underscore the need to hold the Russian Federation fully accountable for violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The only viable path to a lasting peace is for Russia to act in accordance with international law and to respect Ukraine's sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Czechia.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. High Commissioner, we appreciate the presentation of reports. The continued presence of the mission is critical. First of all, we are appalled by the Russians' brutal and cynical missile attacks, including on the Children's Hospital in Kiev yesterday. We will not forget nor forgive those horrendous crimes. We are deeply concerned about the human rights situation in the temporarily occupied Crimea as a consequence of Russia's war against Ukraine. The high numbers of arbitrary arrests and detentions of civilians on political grounds are alarming. So are the numerous cases of torture, ill treatment or executions of civilians and prisoners of war. Politically motivated repressions against Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars started after Russian occupation in 2014, but intensified since 2022. Political prisoners who are seriously ill or elderly, including Irina Danilovic, Volodymyr Anayev, or Rastim Seitmamedov, are the most vulnerable and must be immediately released. Mr. High Commissioner, can you address the growing evidence of sexual and gender-based violence being used as a broader military tactic by Russia against prisoners of war and civilians in detention? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Japan would like to thank the High Commissioner for his oral update. We also appreciate Secretary General's interim report on the human rights situation in Crimea. We remain deeply concerned over the humanitarian and human rights situation in Ukraine. In this regard, Japan fully supports the critical work of the HRMMU and OHCHR, the monitor, report, and advocate on the human rights situation in the country. Japan once again condemns in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a serious violation of international law, including Charter of the United Nations. We reiterate our call on Russia to fulfill its obligation under international law, including international human rights law and humanitarian law. Russia's aggression against the sovereign state of Ukraine is an outrage act that has shaken the very foundation of the international order. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of any nation, large or small, must be respected. Japan strongly opposes the unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion anywhere in the world. Japan will continue to stand with the Ukrainian and the people of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to UNICEF via video.
Mr. President, UNICEF welcomes this oral presentation. As the conflict in Ukraine continues into its 3rd year, children remain the most vulnerable to its far-reaching impacts. Recently, as hostilities increased in Kharkiv region, thousands evacuated from heavily affected areas, including children and families who found themselves displaced from their homes and separated from their communities, uncertain of when or if they will ever return home. The psychological impact of the conflict on children in Ukraine is already acute. New rounds of displacement only serve to exacerbate the prolonged distress threatening children. Further, ongoing attacks on critical infrastructure have necessitated a policy of rolling blackouts to manage Ukraine's energy consumption. These blackouts disproportionately impact the 5.3 million children in Ukraine who have already suffered learning losses due to limited access to in-person education. Should attacks on infrastructure continue, the upcoming winter will be a harsh one for children and may lead to further displacement. UNICEF is horrified by the news out on 8 July that at least 150 people have reportedly been killed or injured, and the children's hospital severely damaged in Kiev during a wave of deadly missile strikes across the country. UNICEF continues to call for immediate compliance with international human rights law and humanitarian law and the end of grave violations against children. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Canada.
Monsieur le Vice-président, la guerre d'agression de la Russie contre l'Ukraine a entraîné d'importantes violations des droits de la personne. Le rapport du Haut-Commissaire met en lumière une tendance continue à la torture, au décès en détention, à la violence sexuelle et fondée sur le genre et aux autres mauvais traitements infligés aux prisonniers de guerre ukrainiens en Russie. Le rapport témoigne également des souffrances continues et dévastatrices des civils dues à cette guerre, y compris des bombardements et des frappes de missiles dans des zones peuplées et sur des infrastructures essentielles. Parmi les sites les plus grandement touchés se trouve le plus grand hôpital pour enfants d'Ukraine, où sont hospitalisés les enfants gravement malades. Les civils doivent être épargnés. Le Canada demeure profondément préoccupé par le rapport faisant état de transfert d'enfants ukrainiens à l'intérieur des territoires temporairement occupés de l'Ukraine par les forces et groupes armés russes et de leur expulsion illégale vers la Russie. La Russie doit mettre fin à l'expulsion illégale et au transport forcé d'enfants et veiller à ce qu'ils soient retournés rapidement. Les enfants ne sont pas des pions de guerre. Quelles sont les recommandations du Haut-Commissaire pour renforcer les protections des prisonniers de guerre et des civils, y compris les enfants dans les territoires temporairement occupés de l'Ukraine? Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues to entail loss of civilian lives, resulting in devastating damage to civilian property and infrastructure. We condemn yesterday's horrendous attack on Children's Hospital in Kiev, which has left peaceful residents, including children, killed and injured. It is deeply alarming that every report gives further shocking evidence of gross violations of international law committed by Russia in Ukraine. These infringements include war crimes, torture, and discrimination on ethnic grounds, especially against Crimean Tatars. Georgia once again underlines the necessity of ensuring accountability of perpetrators through international legal mechanisms. As the party, Georgia welcomes the opening of the Register of Damage for Submission of Claims and the establishment of the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crimes of Aggression against Ukraine. We reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to immediately suspend the military operations and withdraw all its forces and armaments from the whole territory of Ukraine in compliance with the provisional measures of the ICJ of 16 March 2022. We also reiterate call on Russia to give OHCHR and other human rights monitoring mechanisms unimpeded access to the Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Australia deplores yesterday's deadly Russian missile attacks on hospitals treating women and children. Our condolences go to the loved ones of those killed. Russia's unprovoked aggression continues unabated, with now over 11,000 civilian lives lost, 21,000 civilians injured and millions displaced. High Commissioner, the OHCHR's documentation of human rights violations are essential to efforts to hold Russia to account for its brutal invasion. Australia remains steadfast in its support for Ukraine. We pay tribute to the unwavering resilience and courage of the Ukrainian people. Australia recognises the devastating impact on vulnerable populations, including women, children, the elderly and people with disabilities. We are deeply concerned by your report that Russia's attacks on critical energy infrastructure have left many Ukrainians without power. Australia's recent contribution of $20 million to the Ukraine Energy Support Fund will help Ukraine meet its highest priority needs. But, High Commissioner, what more can be done to ensure Ukrainians have resilient alternate energy systems before the winter months? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation thanks the High Commissioner for his update. As described in the recent report by OHCHR, Russia's intensified military operation seeking to further capture Ukrainian territory resulted in increased civilian casualties and damage to civilian property and infrastructure, particularly near the front line. In particular, we are deeply concerned that Russia's sustained attacks on energy infrastructure may deprive civilians of vital services necessary for survival and exacerbate Ukraine's already dire humanitarian crisis. The Republic of Korea strongly urges Russia to stop targeting civilian infrastructure and to comply with its obligations under international law. Mr. Vice President, the repeated reports of the alleged patterns of torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence, arbitrary detention, and summary executions by Russia in a pervasive atmosphere of impunity are highly concerning. In light of the importance of accountability and justice for victims, we support the work of OHCHR and other human rights monitoring mechanisms and urge Russia to grant them unfettered access to the occupied territories to fulfill their mandate. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Germany.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. High Commissioner, Germany aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. Today, for us here in Geneva, it's Tuesday, the 9th of July. For the people in Ukraine, it's day 867. For 867 days now, Russia's unprovoked, unjustified and illegal war of aggression ravages Ukrainian cities, destroys civilian infrastructure and terrorizes the Ukrainian people. Just yesterday, Russia hit a children's hospital in Kiev, burying babies under rubble, what we strongly condemn. For 867 days, we are witnessing the indiscriminate attacks by Russian forces against civilians and medical institutions, extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detentions, rape and sexual violence, torture, murder, abductions, and other serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Your oral update, Mr. High Commissioner, and the interim report of the Secretary-General presented here today confirm these atrocities. Your work, Mr. High Commissioner, is of immeasurable value to counter Russian disinformation campaigns and to shed light on the harrowing human rights situation in the occupied parts of Ukraine. The distressing findings in both reports underscore the need to ensure accountability for the grave violations of international law that have taken place within Ukraine's borders since the 24th of February 2022, and already much longer in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, being under Russian occupation already before this day.
Thank you very much for this statement. The time has elapsed. I give the floor to the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. High Commissioner, we share your horror at the strike of Ukraine's largest children's hospital and your concerns over the deplorable human rights situation in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, including Crimea. The OSCE's April 25th Moscow Mechanism report concluded that Russia's forces are orchestrating a consistent and deliberate pattern of unjust detainment of Ukraine civilians on a massive scale. It also found that tens of thousands of civilians have been detained incommunicado across areas occupied by Russia's forces, in most cases without ever being informed of their supposed crime. High Commissioner, we appreciate your report's continued attention to civilian detainees and careful documentation of the torture and ill treatment they have endured, including severe beatings, deprivation of food and water, electric shocks, and mock executions. We were deeply concerned by the number of civilian casualties in May. The report noted it was the highest number since June 2023 and attributed the increase to Russia's launch of ground offensive in Kharkiv region. Of course, Russia continues to threaten not just Ukrainians, but Ukrainian culture as well, through mass deportation and other efforts to deny and suppress Ukrainian identity. We remain particularly concerned about restrictions Crimean Tatars face in maintaining their identity and culture. High Commissioner Turk, what steps is OHCHR taking to gain access to information on civilian detention?
Thank you very much for the statement. I give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Slovenia aligns with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for his update. Slovenia once again reiterates its condemnation of the Russian Federation's war of aggression against Ukraine. As a strong advocate of child protection, Slovenia strongly condemns yesterday's Russian missile attack on Children's Hospital in Kiev, a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. We remain deeply concerned about the deportations and forcible transfers of Ukrainian children. We join the Secretary General in urging Russian Federation to cooperate with the UN on the return and reunification of Ukrainian children with their families. Furthermore, we are alarmed by the findings on the treatment of detainees, including torture, ill treatment, and conflict-related sexual violence. We condemn the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, which can never be considered legitimate military targets. Let me reiterate that all forms of violence against civilians are unacceptable and must cease immediately. We call upon all parties to the conflict to fully uphold their obligations under international law, including international human rights law and humanitarian law. Ensuring accountability for their violations is a legal and moral imperative. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-président. Le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne. Monsieur le Commissaire, votre rapport révèle les méthodes perfides utilisées par la Russie sur le champ de bataille et dans les territoires temporairement occupés de l'Ukraine. L'attaque méprisable par la Russie de l'hôpital pédiatrique de Kiev en est une illustration supplémentaire et nous la condamnons dans les termes les plus forts. L'utilisation massive de bombes guidées par la Russie dans des zones densément peuplées a tué presque 500 civils has wounded nearly 500 civilians over the last 3 months and has created destruction to essential civilian infrastructure. This using this tactic is dark on many fronts. That Russia is directly committing war crimes. The previous reports of the observation mission and the Commission of Inquiry in the Ukraine has documented ample and generalized actions such as these and the use of torture by Russia and ill treatment and sexual violence against prisoners of war, Ukrainians, and also Ukrainian civilians in their occupied territories. The presence, again, is a testimony, additional testimony that those responsible for these actions be brought to justice. Russia's endlessly must instantly respect these obligations of international humanitarian law and human rights. We call upon, again, Russia to put an end to these aggressions and withdraw without delay from these territories that are internationally recognized as Ukrainian. What can we do to better support the prisoners of war in Ukraine? Thank you.
Belgium.
Monsieur le Vice-président, la Belgique continue de condamner la guerre d'agression non provoquée et injustifiée de la Russie contre l'Ukraine et les violations continues par la Russie du droit international des droits de l'homme et du droit international humanitaire en Ukraine, commises en toute impunité. La Russie a détruit près de 60% de l'infrastructure énergétique ukrainienne. Nous sommes profondément préoccupés par l'arrivée de l'hiver et par l'impact des coupures d'électricité sur les droits humains du peuple ukrainien, notamment sur les enfants qui suivent l'école en ligne et qui n'ont n'auront plus accès à l'Internet. Nous sommes profondément alarmés par la pression constante exercée sur les Ukrainiens des territoires.
Told me when I was a very young man. Well, my brother, Black Billy, told me when I was a very young man. Till you get what you want, take anything you can. You know my woman, she put me out for another man. She left me standing round crying with concrete in my pants. But till I get what I want, I'll take anything I can. This you should understand. I don't want no skinny woman.